Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. My name's Michael Cooper. I serve as the Associate Vice President in the University of Oxford's North American office here in New York City, where it's about 80-some degrees out today and rather humid. I will serve as your Master of Ceremonies today for an event I'm very excited about, Politics and Power, How Digital Humanities Can Help Us Explore the Past. But before we jump into the substance of the program, I'd like to take just a few minutes to put this discussion in a broader context for you, if I may. Many of you will know that the university has recently launched a project to build a new humanities center at the heart of the old Radcliffe Observatory corridor in Oxford. This effort has been made possible by a very generous gift, an extraordinary gift really, from Stephen A. Schwarzman, who gave us 150 million pounds, close to $200 million to kickstart this project. It really is an extraordinary gift, the largest gift the university has received since the Renaissance, in fact, and maybe for all time. We have a difficult time valuing those pre-Renaissance gifts, if you will. But why have we done this? You know, Oxford has been teaching the humanities for quite some time. We have evidence of teaching in Oxford dating back to 1096, when the liberal arts were taught in the city, and nearly a 1,000 years if we round up a bit. We have the largest humanities faculty in the world, and we're consistently ranked the #1 humanities program in the world. So why now, and why undertake such a big effort? Well, there are three reasons, really, three main goals that we have. I mean, we want to find a way to amplify Oxford's voice and to increase our social impact. So we've decided to do that with three primary pillars, if you will. So the first is just unlocking new insights by combining or bringing together, uniting in the same building, 7 different humanities faculties. We're hoping to create some new synergies with a new library and other facilities. So unlocking new insights is the first goal. The second goal is just meeting new challenges, thinking about how we can apply humanities to the problems of our time, whether that's climate change or friction in our political discourse or other matters. In fact, the keystone of that particular program is a new institute that we're launching to focus on the ethics of artificial intelligence. So really looking forward and meeting new challenges and what can the humanities tell us, taking the lessons that the humanities have taught us and applying them to the world that STEM, if you will, has brought us, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So that's the second goal, is meeting new challenges. And the third goal is engaging new audiences. And that's really where this digital humanities program that we're about to explore comes in. We really need new audiences and new partners, not only to help us find the answers, but also to help us shape the questions. So when people think of an institution like Oxford, the words that may come to mind are certainly things like competitive. I think that's obvious. It's one of the most competitive schools on the face of the planet. But they may also be inclined to think of words like exclusive or elite or privileged. Oxford's been working really hard in the past decade or so to sort of break out of those stereotypes about the institution. We've invested heavily in equity and inclusion. And I think it's fair to say now, at least at the undergraduate level, our student population really reflects the broader makeup of the country in the UK and around the world. So why do we need these new audiences? Part of it, as I said before, is to really increase our social impact and to amplify our voice. But it's also to position the university in a different place. When people think of Oxford, they often think of these quadrangles where knowledge is secluded for the few. But we want, with this new building, to really open up that space and to invite people into the university. We're hoping that in the future, one of the words that people will associate with the University of Oxford is generous, to think of an institution that's giving knowledge and that's inviting people in. That's really where the digital humanities comes in. This new space will not only bring faculties and libraries together, but it will also include a number of channels for outreach to these new audience, a new concert hall, a black box theater, a 250-seat performance space, and other facilities, TV broadcasting and other facilities. But really at the heart of this struggle to engage the broader audience around the world is the digital humanities. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm just going to briefly introduce Megan Gooch. Megan is the head of the Center for Digital Scholarship and Digital Humanities Research at Oxford. She works both in the Humanities Division and in the Bodleian Libraries. Megan has her PhD in early medieval numismatics. She's a big fan of coins. She is a trustee, in fact, of the Royal Numismatic Society and on the steering committee of the Money and Metals Network. One of the things that Megan does is really work to create relationships beyond Oxford with other partners in the digital humanities to bring together the assets that Oxford has to offer, but also to engage external partners as well. She has recently worked on a project called Lest We Forget Poppies and Public Commemoration, and is also on the steering committee of what looks like a very fascinating project, War and Conflict. She's a subject specialist there in the Subject Specialist Network. So, Dr. Gooch, if I may, I'll turn the floor over to you and to our two extraordinary speakers.
Thank you very much, Michael.
One other quick logistical note here is that we will be taking some questions at the end of the presentations. Unfortunately, you won't be able to raise your hand or to speak, but you can type any questions that you may have into the Q&A portion of your Zoom, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Gooch. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to Oxford, everybody, at least metaphorically. That's my gift to you today. I'm here representing both our researchers and our professionals working in libraries and museums across Oxford who are engaged in digital humanities and digital scholarship. And while the terminology may be rather new to you, it's actually something that's been going on in Oxford since the 1970s, when the Humanities Computing Unit was at the forefront of bringing humanities and computerized techniques into research. Like so much at Oxford, a lot of our expertise is distributed across faculties, departments, different subject areas, libraries, our museums, our colleges. And I'm delighted to be able to bring two of those disparate nodes of digital humanities at Oxford to you today. Nicholas Cole from Pembroke College and Andrew Castworth from the Bodleian Libraries. Because we have got this really long history of digital humanities at Oxford, it seems almost, for such a subject that sounds new, that has been going on for so long, and in which we actually have researchers who are now coming to fruition, who are digital natives, born digital in their research methods, but there is still lots of work to do and lots of exciting activities going on. It was recently, last week, our 10th anniversary of our Digital Humanities at Oxford Summer School, in which we trained 460 participants in the methods and theories of digital humanities, by far our biggest ever summer school, reaching people from over 44 countries and over 20 different disciplines. And we're also launching a new master's degree, an MSc in digital scholarship. Applications open in September for entry next autumn. So how to turn such a kind of vast areas of study into something for short and snappy lunchtime event for you. We settled on the idea of politics and power, and I was aware of the work of Andrew and Nicholas, because they come from very different types of political power, from different kind of constitutions. But like most of the research in digital humanities at Oxford, they come primarily from a humanistic point of view. They are asking humanistic questions, but using different types of digital tools to really get at those questions. And as Michael mentioned, this is a trajectory that will only get better with the new Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities, where all of our faculties will be in one place. And we're really, really hoping that the interdisciplinarity that is inherent in digital humanities will be absolutely brought to the fore when literally for the first time in Oxford history, all those faculties will be within talking distance of each other, and we'll have more opportunities to develop new areas of exciting research. But to start off with, I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Cusworth. who has recently completed work as the 1851 Research Fellow at the Bodleian Libraries. He's been engaged in digital research since his PhD in the University of Wales. And this project was looking at the collections of Prince Albert and was a collaboration between the libraries, the Royal Collection Trust, aka the place that has the Queen's stuff, and the Royal Commission for the Exhibition of 1851. I'm absolutely delighted that Andrew is now in my team, working as an operations manager for digital scholarship at Oxford and helping promote not only his own research, but that of all of our researchers across and beyond the university. Over to you, Andrew.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Megan, for that introduction. It's going to be quite hard to live up to it. Thank you. And so having been introduced, I'd like to introduce in turn Prince Albert, subtitled here, Prince Albert the Good and Prince Albert the Man. Prince Albert, as Megan has intimated, has been until recently the center of my work in digital humanities and indeed archives, which is the other major area of interest for me. Prince Albert was born at the Schloss Rosenau near Coburg in 1819, just a few months after his cousin Victoria, who would later be Queen of England, was born in England. They were married in 1840 after she proposed to him as dictated by royal protocol, and here is Prince Albert, and there is their wedding. Their married life, which came to be so much the model of middle-class domestic propriety, was perhaps fierier than is well known, though their love was undoubtedly intense and passionate, as indicated by letters between them. Prince Albert himself was a man of unusually varied and rounded talents. Amongst other things, as a young man, he maintained a surprisingly demanding fitness regimen. He was a very competent organist, singer, and composer. He was a skilled draftsman. He had a smattering of law after attending the university in Bonn for a little while, where he'd been preceded a few years earlier by Karl Marx. And combining all of the above, and above all of the above, he had a keen mind that combined a rigorous interest in detail with an unswerving attitude towards work. His marriage to Victoria placed him at the heart of a thriving empire and brought him significant potential influence. But in and of itself, it came without any power. He struggled at times, as he noted in a letter, that he was only the husband and not the master in the house, clearly at a time when being the master in the house itself was very much expected. This sense of disenfranchisement was deepened by a reduced allowance granted to him by Parliament, and that despite all of Victoria's efforts, he held no constitutional authority. He was granted the usage of His Royal Highness after his marriage, rather than His Serene Highness, which he'd inherited. But he was not allowed the title of Prince Consort until quite late in his life in 1857. His manner was at times unpalatable in England, initially with suspicion and distaste. It was met with suspicion and distaste. But by demonstration of competence and determination, he gradually won public approbation, though he was not free from occasional controversy, and his rancorous relationship with certain political figures is well documented. At the time of his death in 1861, he was inarguably one of the most powerful men in the world. He was styled as Albert the Good, as if a great king had passed away. He'd been at the forefront of the Great Exhibition. He'd been at the forefront of reform, including on slavery. He'd been the president of the Royal Society of Arts, of which Benjamin Franklin was an erstwhile member, and had, by all accounts, some of them rather eulogistic, made an outstanding contribution to British life. He had even, in the last weeks of his life, diffused the Trent Affair, a standoff between the United States and the United Kingdom that might easily have erupted into a war that may, in turn, have had significant geopolitical implications had it taken place. Albert the man and his works have received a new burst of interest in recent years, as efforts have been made to uncover the full extent of the impact upon events of the time of a man one biographer titled The Uncrowned King. Amongst those efforts, and in honor of his 200th birthday, was the recent large-scale digitization project to which I was attached in my role as an 1851 Commission Research Fellow at the Bodleian Libraries. Sponsored by the Royal Commission for the Exhibition of 1851, a body founded by Albert himself to undertake the organisation of the Great Exhibition, and that remains and still disperses the profits of the exhibition. This Royal Collection Trust project has digitised and made freely available online some 25,000 items from the Royal Archives, the archive of the 1851 Commission itself, and the Royal Collection. My role as an academic adjunct to this project, and my relevance perhaps to this evening, was to consider how digital humanities methods might be used to enhance the understanding of these digitized materials. Clearly, digitization, the creation of free public access to these materials, is a huge step forward in and of itself. The Royal Archives are held in the round tower of Windsor Castle, which you can see at the back right here, which is literally an ivory tower, well, a stone tower, complete with 100 steps and a cannon pointing down them towards the door. It is the archetypal type of secure archive into which only a very select few may enter. There's now a research room there, but the research room can only house 4 people at a time. But rather than focusing simply on accessibility, my work was to go a little further, to imagine what else might be possible with the collections. It began in a rather diffuse way, experimenting with ideas such as digital transcription, timelines of collection items created digitally, geographical mapping of collection items and networks of correspondence, and network diagramming. Some of these I delved into a little more deeply, setting up workshops to transcribe documents with students during the closures of the pandemic, and thus generating a new form of engagement with the materials at a difficult time, asking people to use them in new ways and integrate how they think about them into a new workflow. However, the thing that captured my attention most in my experiments was related to something that I'd noticed in the archives themselves. From around 1850, Prince Albert began to gather a collection of copies of every known work of art by Raphael, creating from it a structured art historical collection based on contemporary biographies and analyses of the artist's work. As well as working with cutting-edge photographic techniques in an act of mass remediation that served as a neat parallel to my own work in digital remediation and the digitization of this archive. This was a work of deep communication, of diplomatic networks spread across the world, of letters, of networks of photographers and collectors. Collectors of Raphael's work all over the world were traced and contacted. Photographers were hired and sent to copy each artwork. The copies were carefully transported back and arranged in these folios, which you can see on screen at the moment, which were and are still stored in a specially built cabinet in a specially built room at Windsor Castle, with the intention of creating a resource of unique value in the field of art history and art training. The Raphael collection wasn't completed within Albert's lifetime. It was some 15 years later that the line was drawn underneath it. But it was felt to be of such importance within Windsor and the royal household that the work on it continued. The extent of this network of correspondence for a project of private interest was a surprising one. And there are some 500 letters about it that still remain in the Royal Archives. It's not a comprehensive set, but it confers a large part of it. But as I created the network diagram to show the connections that drove the project, what interested me most about it was that Prince Albert himself, and I shall show you here, is almost invisible. Other figures, notably his librarians, write dozens of letters. Prince Albert only a handful. Where was the great man? And if we look a little into this diagram, we can see that Prince Albert has 3 correspondents in the Raphael network, whereas here Karl Ruland, one of his librarians, has 33 or more. The network is not quite complete yet. And this pattern then is echoed in the correspondence surrounding the Great Exhibition. Much correspondence relays the will of Prince Albert, or is addressed to be seen by him in some manner, or addresses remarks by him. But it's distributed amongst his advisors, amongst the commissioners of the Royal Commission, of which he himself was president. And here we can see Prince Albert has 9 correspondents during the 1850 build-up towards the exhibition, whereas other correspondents, such as, who is this? The Royal Commissioners, for example, had 28. John Scott Russell had 83. And so there are very large figures within this network who would seem to supersede Prince Albert, but actually in terms of influence probably do not. And what struck me is that in a large stack of papers, all of which are closely associated with Prince Albert by their inclusion in associated archives, or in a wealth of digitized documents, all of which bear Prince Albert's signature on a website banner under which they appear, the context of these letters lend a weight to Prince Albert's ownership of them that isn't quite there. They seem somehow to be from Albert, to all involve Albert. However, seen in these network diagrams with stark statistics, something else emerges. One starts to see Albert in a new way, as a man whose authority was distributed through others. He had no constitutional power, he had no state authority, but he certainly knew how to exercise soft power through his position as advisor to the Queen, through careful surveying of documents that came through her, through his occasionally rather direct missives and memoranda to those around him. Despite all of the statues that have been built to him, all of the monuments created and the streets named after him, there's relatively little in relation to that bears Albert's signature, and yet his influence was enormous, carried through these networks of other people. And perhaps one of the great examples of this is that very thing mentioned earlier, the Trent Affair. And here is Albert reviewing the Trent Affair memorandum, which came to him and was so sternly worded that he felt it would surely create a war between the United States and Britain. For me, archives are a place of exchange. They're filled with the fragments of past activities, the traces of communications and events that give us an impression of the shape of things we've lost. These letters, all archival materials, are but a part of the story, a hint of the conversations, the activities, the events behind them, and the people. But navigating them is a really significant challenge. Finding ways to organize them, to reorganize them again and again to suit new questions, to suit new research, to suit new ideas, to find new means of reading the archive is challenging. And for me, that is part of the role of digital humanities. For if the archive is the source of legitimacy for our narration of our histories, the authority from which we derive history, how we organize it dictates how we access it and dictates what we can say from it. By filtering archives through digital means, by reorganizing them and allowing the reorganization of them to be done by the viewer, by the person accessing them, we begin to construct historical narratives in new ways, even if we do so subconsciously. Writing in The Future of Nostalgia, the theorist Svetlana Boym suggested that to unearth the fragments of nostalgia, one needs a dual archaeology, of memory and of place, and a dual history of illusions and of actual practices. I first encountered this quotation when I was building a digital resource on Welsh traditional music for my PhD. This idea helped me to frame what I believed digital methodologies could offer an historical field filled with tradition, with sentiment, with nostalgia. It was a new lens under which to examine ideas, to explore things, and a means of analyzing and navigating historical materials to test our instincts and expectations, to renegotiate how we see, literally sometimes, our relationship between cultural narrative and the material we derive that narrative from. Between Prince Albert the Good, the man of authority, the memorialized man, and Prince Albert, who was constitutionally disempowered, but had towering influence and was a man of great activity. Digital humanities, digital archives, digital methods of navigating and interpreting these archives are, for me, archaeological tools through which we renegotiate our understanding of the relationship between shared illusions of culture and the sharp details of history and their workings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And we will have time for some questions later. So if you do have any, and I see we've already got one to start us off, please pop it in the Q&A section below. Thank you. I'm particularly struck by your picture there of the Royal Archive at Windsor, and literally a building designed to keep people out as a fortified castle. And that's where they keep everything. So the power of digitization and releasing some of those secrets cannot be understated. Our next speaker is Dr. Nicholas Cole, and I'm also delighted to call him a colleague and learn about his work. From the royal history of a man with a big title but perhaps very little power, we go to Nicholas's research on the details of America's first politicians and negotiating politics in post-independence America. So from the power of the monarch to the power of the people. He studies how constitutions are created, negotiated, discussed and enacted. And the flagship work of his research is the Quill Project, presenting the records of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So over to Nicholas to hear more about his take on politics and power with digital humanities.
Right. Thank you very much indeed for having me. Thank you, Megan, for introducing me, and Michael and Andrew for putting this together. So, computers and the American Constitution. Now, I study constitutional history, which not that long ago seemed like a very unfashionable kind of field. And I think before we get onto the digital side of things, we might just pause for a minute or two and say, well, why in the 21st century study constitutional history, this field that had been in retreat? I think one answer to that is that the constitutional orders that we are all used to and which we thought not so long ago would endure are now under an enormous amount of pressure, not only from countries around the world that want to promote alternative forms of government, but from groups within our own countries that no longer see liberal democratic constitutions as the answers to the problems that we face. And so it seems to me that for that reason alone, we need to have some much better understandings of the institutions that we've inherited. But also because there are debates in both America and Britain about how to interpret constitutional texts. Even though Britain doesn't have a single written constitution, it has a lot of constitutional statutes that are now being interpreted by increasingly powerful courts. And in America, the question of constitutional interpretation will definitely shape the politics of the next decade. And without exception, all theories of constitutional interpretation make some kind of historical claim, either about the nature of language or about the circumstances in which language was written. And it's those questions that I'm most interested in looking at. And it's those questions that I think computers in the end are going to make some of our most important contributions to. But let me start with one of Pembroke's old undergraduates talking in his commentaries on the laws of England, setting out for us just how complicated it can be to interpret law, and saying that the fairest and most rational method to interpret the will of the legislature is by exploring his intentions, either by looking at the words of the text themselves, the words of the Constitution or legislation itself, or the context in which it was written, or the context in which it was written, but with an understanding of the subject matter, or by what the legislature might have been trying to achieve, or at an even deeper level, the sort of reason and spirit behind the idea of legislating at all. So for Blackstone, sorting out the meaning of constitutional language was quite a difficult and layered question. And I think he was correct, even though some people in the modern age try and present some shortcuts towards particular answers that they prefer. In America, perhaps this quotation is one of the most famous quotations on the interpretation of law of our age. It's John Roberts talking at his confirmation hearing to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 2005. He said, "If I'm confirmed, I will confront every case with an open mind. I will fully and fairly analyze the legal arguments that are presented. I will be open to the considered views of my colleagues, and I will decide every case on the record according to the will of law without fear or favor. I will remember it is my job to call balls and strikes, not to pitch or bat." This idea of the role of the judge as kind of a mechanical one. I think the metaphor that he's using here, and I know most people on the call will recognize it as a reference to American baseball, but just for any British people on the call, what he's referring to is the job of the umpire in baseball to determine whether a ball traveling at about 100 miles an hour has passed through this imaginary strike zone, making it fair for the batsman to hit or not. And I think, in fact, this metaphor tells us a little bit more than the Chief Justice perhaps intended, because, of course, in baseball, this really is a judgment call in a way that in a game like, say, cricket, where there's a set of stumps to hit, it's just not quite the same kind of judgment being made. And that leads us to this question: is it still possible to have a good faith conversation about the meaning of text? After all, many of the people who stormed the US Capitol in January thought that they had understandings of the Constitution that justified their actions and articulated actually quite interesting interpretations of text, even if not ones widely shared. So how can computers then help to make our understanding of the processes that have written law, and therefore the interpretation of law, perhaps better? Or if you're not a jurist and you're just a historian like me, how can we understand better the ways in which constitutional texts have been agreed simply from a historical point of view? The problem that we immediately face is that the records of these processes are hardly inviting. These processes, by the way, that America really invents after its revolution in 1776. America pioneers the idea that constitutional text should be written not by a lone wise man being asked to write down a law code, as has happened in the ancient and early modern world, but rather constitutions should be written by groups of people, processes that took extended periods of time. The Federal Convention is 3 to 4 months in 1787, and that's the sort of average amounts of time that it tends to take to write a constitutional text, although some processes can take much longer. And the manuscript records that we have, even for the Federal Convention, which was a relatively straightforward process, are extremely complicated, both as sort of collections of artifacts. We have both formal and informal records that need collating, often written in ways that need quite a lot of editorial work to sort out on scraps of paper that need to be put together. We know that a lot of the record is incomplete. We know that some of it was destroyed as being perhaps not interesting to people in the future. And so delving into these records is a difficult task in and of itself. But even if you have the benefit, as we do for the 1787 convention, of a lot of 19th and early 20th century editorial work, including good transcriptions of the major records, and even if those records are then presented online in quite modern and legible form, it is still a process that is very hard to understand, because the way that groups of people can write law together is by slowly going through iterations of documents, paragraph by paragraph, suggesting changes. This is a process that was pioneered in the British Parliament in the early modern period and inherited by America, and is essentially the way globally that groups of people have been able to write text. But it is a very intricate process, and it's not one that it's easy to then interrogate later. It's enormously taxing for the reader. So that if you just have a list of propositions or a list of decisions taken on propositions, bearing in mind that there can be a gap of days or weeks between a proposal being made and a decision being taken upon it, it can be very hard to keep in your mind exactly the text that would have been available to everybody working within that process. So one very fundamental thing that you might want to be able to do is to be able to see for any moment in this process the text that was actually under negotiation. Now, you can do this without computers, and historians who have worked on these records have all kept their own private notebooks where they've tried to keep track of what's going on. But computers let you actually just present this in a very straightforward way. Present to readers both descriptions from official and unofficial records, images and manuscripts, a reconstruction of what the text under discussion at that particular moment would be, a list of proposals that have been tabled and not yet decided upon, and all kinds of other information that lets you reconstruct as closely as I think we will ever get the precise context, of any intervention that is being made or any decision that is being taken upon that sort of intervention. And what this reveals when you lay it all out is the sheer complexity of the process of writing even quite a short document. The text of the original Constitution of the federal government of the United States is 2,500 words in length or thereabout. And if you map out the process of creating it, you're looking at the consideration of around 80 distinct documents, pieces of paper that at some point were tabled for discussion or debate or consideration or were part of establishing the legitimacy of the process, and around 1,000 amendments, or in other words, approximately one proposed amendment for each sort of couple of words in the final text in order to reach the final document. So that meant that, just to do that task of pulling together the text being discussed for any particular moment has meant that as a project, we need to think carefully about how we store data. How do we think about what it means to propose an amendment in a sort of quasi-parliamentary process? And to think differently about what it means to store text, because we can't simply store thousands and thousands and thousands of different iterations of documents. What we need to store is all of the different proposals and then build on demand the document in question. So we can build arbitrary versions of the Constitution, including some amendments, excluding others, and so on, so that we can sort of step through not only the timeline as it really existed, but hypothetical timelines. How would it have been if such and such an amendment had been agreed at one moment and not another? How would that have changed the sort of flow of debate? And all of that lets us track much more closely the interventions of individuals in the convention and get away from some of the more established narratives. And it also lets us ask questions that we haven't been able to ask with any precision at all before. How accurate are our records of the 1787 convention, for example? Are there variant readings that would emerge if we followed one authority rather than another? We spent some months building computer code to do this. It turns out actually our records are much more accurate than we ever imagined, and we didn't need it, but there we are. A null result can be a result too in this field. We had to think about how we present information, how we think about visualizing this process of parliamentary debate, and introducing users to new visualizations is difficult. Coming up with new visualizations is difficult, and thinking about how information can be better represented for fields that have not been represented visually before can be very difficult indeed, and that can take a lot of interdisciplinary work. I'm very, very grateful to colleagues at King's College London, for example, helping think through some of the issues here. And lastly, we need to think about how people get information out of the system. What does it mean to search a database like this? Perhaps you're a lawyer and you're looking for a particular phrase, so you want to know when it was first proposed and when decisions were taken upon it. But of course, a phrase can appear in a text, not because anybody proposed that particular phrase, but because of the interaction of different proposals made at different times. So how do we help users like lawyers answer that kind of question? How do we help other kinds of users find the information that they want for their particular tasks? So that's very difficult. And one of the really exciting things that this kind of project can do. And then lastly, the reason to do this is that the ability to do better analysis can drive better archival research. So we worked very, very hard on our data entry model, and there are students here, not from Oxford, but from Utah Valley University, which I'll say a bit more about in just a moment, looking at the records of the Illinois Constitutional Convention from the late 60s in America, and boxes in the archives, and they're working through them for us. We worked very hard on a system for data entry that would let historians be historians, we let people work on historical records, build the data sets we needed, but without learning sort of squiggly computer code and coding language. And also a data entry model that would guide future research, so that we would create a virtuous circle where the need to know what had gone on a particular day in a lot of detail would drive a better exploration of the archives. Because it turns out that America's national sport is really writing constitutions for itself. I put some statistics on the screen, I won't go through them all now, but since 1776, there have been 235 state constitutions written from scratch through some kind of convention process. That doesn't count other constitutions written for native peoples who've also written constitutions for themselves, often also through convention processes. And the archives for almost none of these constitutional conventions have been edited in the way that the 19th century scholars edited the work of the federal convention. So it turns out that we don't really know with much precision how particular bits of language were written for state level constitutional texts, and yet those state level constitutional texts will actually dictate an enormous fraction of the lives of Americans over the next few years. And so the next phase of the project is really to look at this state level tradition of constitution writing, pulling together not just official records, but unofficial records. In the case of modern conventions, perhaps even sound recordings, definitely newspaper accounts and records of public debate, and using all of that to construct sophisticated models that show how constitutional language evolves across America over the last 200 years. These are the projects that we've published at the moment that you can find on our website. The federal records, the writing of the Bill of Rights in 1789, Utah's Constitutional Convention in 1895, and the 19th Amendment that had its anniversary last year. And I might just use a couple of seconds to say as well that all of these projects have driven us to investigate archives that were not publicly available in the way that one would have thought before we did the work. And particularly for the Bill of Rights, this involved an awful lot of work with archival records to build the model in a way that really surprised us. But all of these projects have had that feature. This is a selection of the projects that we're working on at the moment, with Arizona State University looking at Arizona's 1910 Constitutional Convention, some work on founding era constitutional text with graduate students in Oxford, work on Illinois I've already mentioned. We have a major project on the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments that will be published around October, November this year, with a conference in Oxford next summer, some work on some French records, some work on constitution writing in the Western United States. I would be incompetent if we weren't also looking at the legislation around Brexit, because it's so absolutely fascinating. And we've also had some students doing some pilot project work on sort of emergency legislation on both sides of the Atlantic around COVID-19. And I want to finish by just showing you the range of people that have been involved in this work, because while we're very much a project based at Pembroke College in Oxford, we have a very, very close relationship with Utah Valley University, which is an open enrollment university in the Western United States. It couldn't be more different to Oxford in many ways. With other institutions, we've done some major work as well, Arizona State and Rutgers University, and we've worked with students from France and colleagues from other parts of the world as well. And that gives you a sense, I think, of how even a project based in Oxford can actually have a sort of global network of contributors and people who are really colleagues in this effort. And so when Michael talks about Oxford reaching out, this is the kind of work we mean. If you want to know more about what we do, there are some links, including Twitter, which my graduate students insist that I have, which I don't quite understand because I'm too old, but there we are. And I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. And I think Michael's going to go through some of these questions, we've got some fascinating ones there. Thank you very much to those who've asked, and any more, we'll try and squeeze them in, but we are running out of time. Michael.
Yes, absolutely. We'll jump right in, Megan. If you don't mind, I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask my own question up front, if that's possible. So you've created these amazing resources and brought these archives to life with all these tools, the digital translation that can be searched, the timelines, geomapping, network diagrams, all of these things. And you've interrogated that data yourself for the purposes of your own research. But what tools do you have available? And maybe this is also for you, Dr. Gooch, to provoke others to interrogate those systems as well and to produce their own research. And how do you track that research when someone engages with the data? And so how do we bring others in to use these amazing tools that you've created? Or is that still a struggle for you?
I'll go first, Michael. So one is designing the sort of front ends for different sorts of users. And we know we have been cited in state level cases in Utah, for example. So checking that we're serving that kind of community is really, really important for us. We do a lot of work with teachers to think about the tools that we can give to the classroom. A lot of it is about saying to different people that we don't have all the answers. We can give you, as it were, sort of the sort of tools that you might find useful. How do we package them so that you can then create the resources that you need? And I think collaboration in that way is the way forward. We do try and track how people are using us, and we find very surprising answers to that. And sometimes it's about creating machine readable interfaces so that people can do their own analysis. And particularly for graduate students working on projects at other universities, they're more interested in having the machine readable interfaces so that we can then say, yeah, you can build your own visualizations, and great. Yeah.
Excellent.
I'm really pleased to hear Nicholas talk about the different types of people that are using his data, from the teachers to the legislators to the academics, because something that I think is a dawning realization to a lot of researchers is that most members of the general public, if such a thing exists, don't spend their leisure time trawling around databases with digital humanities research on. It's just not that much fun. The British Museum, for example, has got about 4.4 million objects on there, but it's a really, really boring and unrewarding experience just scrolling through, looking at stuff. It's not fun. You might as well just watch television. So there are a new breed of digital humanists really, really thinking about, okay, so what am I doing and how is this interesting to certain types of people? Because not everything is interesting to everyone, and making that accessible. And I think the other thing to note here is really around the kind of fallacy of Google. We all now are used to the fact that everything is, a second away here. There's sort of, have millions and millions of hits. And you think, well, if it's not on there, does it exist? And the work that Andrew and Nicholas and other colleagues at Oxford are doing is, just because it's not been digitized or transcribed or made machine readable, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There's a lot more information out there that we don't know about, that isn't turning up on those searches for various reasons. So there's still loads more to discover, and hopefully in a fun and entertaining way or useful way.
That's great. That's great. Look, I'm going to jump into these questions. I'll just warn the panelists that there are no softballs here. So the first one is a rather politically loaded question, and it's a bit lengthy, but I'll make my way through it. Do you agree, this is for Nicholas, and then I'll have one for Andrew. Do you agree, Nicholas, that the framers of the US Constitution so distrusted the people that they inserted various wedges to safeguard the rights of the minority against majority rule? And do you agree that despite promoting this democratic ideal, they actually believe those who own the country should have the whip in hand in governing it. And then there's a bit more about oligarchy and moneyed interests and things like that. But essentially these power relationships, how do you see them reflected since you've had the opportunity to really wrap your mind around the construction of this document?
That's a very old, it's a very good question, and it's a very old charge against the, sorry about the noise, I've got an American summer school, ironically, outside my office door at the moment. It's a very old charge, and it's based on a couple of speeches that were reported after the convention, people saying, we've got too much democracy at the state level and so on. Actually, if you look at those speeches in context, they often were made before the person who made the speech then lost a vote, or they weren't tied to particular proposals that were successful later. I think, look, it is certainly true that there are elements of the US Constitution designed to frustrate populism in the sense of rapid decision making. You cannot have a quick decision in the United States to make a positive change, because the framers of the Constitution and the framers of state level constitutions wanted to make it difficult to make changes. So, and if you think that injustices need swift action to remedy, that can be very frustrating. If you think that swift action creates injustice, then it's a safeguard. And unfortunately, at different times, different people will be frustrated by that particular decision. So they were definitely against populism, but I don't think that means they were pro-oligarchy, whatever a few people said in misguided ways behind closed doors that then got reported later.
Great. Andrew, here's one for you. It is going to rock your world. It challenges the very premise of your analysis. How do you come to the conclusion that because Prince Albert wrote so few letters, he had such great influence? Why isn't it the opposite conclusion that you've come to?
It's actually sort of what's in the letters. and so what is very clear from the letters is the amount that the things that were sent by his advisors and to his advisors actually passed underneath his eyes. And they relay his views on things a great deal. But also he was extraordinarily heavy in his workload. And so there was a running joke in London that if you could see the light on at Buckingham Palace at 2 in the morning, it was Albert with his candle. So he was very much a detail obsessive, to the extent of having an opinion on the lighting of a diamond at the Royal Exhibition, or correcting an artist's version of perspective when he was painting it. He was in absolutely everything and had his nose in everything in the nicest possible way, and had an opinion on pretty much everything, or wished to discuss things. And so I think it's very much the case that those letters reflect his both the success of the networks that he created, but quite often his influence amongst them.
Great, thank you so much. And Dr. Gooch, if you see the questions are starting to pour in, and it's getting a bit difficult for me to read through them all, so I'm trying to capture the gist of a few of them. Nicholas, go ahead.
I'd like to, there's a really good question from Jonathan Bankson around sustainability of digital projects.
Yeah, okay, great.
The short and long-term trade-offs. So it's absolutely fantastic to see work such as Nicholas's, which is not just pioneering within the field of history, but in technically what you can do with archival research. The problem then might be what happens in 10, 20, 50 years' time, when in the past he might have published a book and the book would be safe and sound on the shelves in the Bodleian Library behind me. We don't have the answers just yet, but actually the Bodleian Libraries, as an institution that takes care of information, not just books, is really thinking about this. And we're working within digital scholarship at Oxford on a project around sustaining some of these flagship digital humanities projects and making sure that they are accessible in 5, 10, 50 years' time. And I've always got at hand my undergraduate thesis on a floppy disk, which is the perfect example of the digital project that is no longer accessible to me nor anybody else in the world. And had I just published it as a book, it would still be there. So there's always going to be that trade-off between the innovation that happens with our research and our researchers, and a way to maintain that in the long term. And the libraries sort of lumber along a few years later and help find ways to make that secure. But yes, we are at a digital crossroads, and digital anxieties around the archiving of our data run rife. I don't know about you, but if I lost my phone or my phone didn't back up, that's 10 years of photos gone. So that's but really, on a bigger scale.
Yeah, no, that's encouraging to know that that kind of work is being done to preserve the digital as well. Nicholas, I suppose there are a couple questions along these lines, but essentially the issue of the integrity of the data itself. I think you had made a comment about accuracy, inaccuracy of the data. So someone asks, is it possible that some of these, documents have been altered through time as they've come into the political discourse? And so really to the issue of accuracy and integrity of the data, because people aren't able to look at the documents themselves and discern it for themselves.
Yeah, and that's a big question. Madison's diary of the convention wasn't published until after his death, generation and a half later, really. And we know that he edited the manuscript. He didn't just keep the manuscript in his desk drawer and then it was published after his death, where he was actively involved in editing it. And Mary Bilder wrote a famous book a few years ago about that process. So we really expected that the official journal in its various forms, and it had been copied and recopied by hand before it was ever printed, and private diaries might not line up, and we might find significant discrepancies in what they described. And it is true that there are events described in one source and not in others. And sometimes the sequence of events in different records is not quite identical. What I think surprised us was the core of this process, which is proposing that a specific form of words be adopted and then taking a decision on those specific forms of words, has not resulted in any significant, aside from spelling and abbreviation changes, variation between the texts. So we've got a whole system to display variant readings of propositions to go into the constitutional text, which kept me awake late into the night for months writing. And then when we actually worked through the months of records, we discovered we didn't need it because, in fact, things lined up much better than we thought. And that's a really interesting result, actually. It tells us something about the accuracy of at least a particular element of the records for the convention.
Very good. The first question that came in, I feel an obligation to represent it. I don't know that, well, you'll tell me if you have an answer or not. We made some representations about Oxford's work in the what we would call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion field, and the enormous strides we've made, especially with the undergraduate population more recently. But this person asks about slavery, and is there anything that you've learned through your work about slavery that might impact the issue of racism today?
There's a big debate about, as it were, how pro-slavery or anti-slavery the convention or members of the convention were, and therefore how pro or anti-slavery is the final federal constitutional text. And that's a really big debate. It's often taught in American high schools that there was a compromise on a particular day around representation for the South, and that was a big moment in the convention, and that's often how it's taught. In fact, discussions that pertain to slavery occupied the convention from its first day through to the very end of the process. And on the very first day, dueling amendments by Madison and by Hamilton said that state representation in the national government should be according to Madison's preference. Money contributed to the federal government, which would have favored the South. Hamilton's preference, free citizens in the states. And those debates went on. The final text, because they were debated line by line, contained many proposals that ended up favoring the South at the time. There was an absolute ban, for example, on the taxing of exports, which is still true. You can't tax exports because Southern delegates at the convention didn't want their exports taxed. And some members of the convention, when they stepped back and looked at the final text or the near final text, said, actually, look, we didn't think we were making lots of concessions, but as we've gone along at every single juncture, we seem to have made concessions to slaveholding delegations. So there is a lot of work to be done there, I think, to further examine the dynamics of those discussions at the convention. I am always cheered, and this is not to excuse anything, but I am always cheered. There was a change made in the very final text of the Constitution when an engrossed copy was sitting on the secretary's table, and they were literally going through making the very final changes. Almost the last change made to the text clarifies that anybody held in slavery in the United States was being held according to state law, not according to federal law. And I've always been very pleased in a way that was one of the final changes, because I think it did really, it didn't absolve the federal government of its involvement in supporting the institution of slavery, but it certainly said, you know, this is a consequence of state level law, not a consequence of federal law.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Look, we're running a little bit over time. Andrew, if you don't mind, I'll ask you one last question and then maybe see if Megan has any closing remarks, and then I'll close us out quickly. So I've actually lost it in the thread here. It seems to have vanished, but there was a question talking about close reading and distant reading. So this idea of distant reading, of looking kind of at what the big data world can tell you, and the close intimate reading of really getting very closely associated with the documents themselves. And is there something that's lost along the way? So maybe the bigger question is, you know, you've created these amazing tools, but is there something we lose in this digital world that we don't get if we're, you know, looking through dusty box number 387 in the basement of the archives?
I'm going to roll two questions into one, possibly, with this. And so the other around trust and questioning of digital resources, which has been asked by Jennifer. So I'm not necessarily the strongest answerer for digital and distant and close reading. However, I think they're complementary methods. I don't think that it's necessary to take one over the other. I think that they sit quite well together, looking through these, as the question mentions, kind of oceans of material to try and understand patterns within it, and also looking down at a very, very detailed level at matters of style, matters of content, matters of voice, all of the things that a traditional humanist might expect to do. And I think that those things are complemented very well, partly through digitization of archives and the increase of accessibility, partly through teaching really good close reading methods and applying close reading methods in digital ways. And then also, as you can see from some of the things I showed, I have a kind of interest in at least semi-distant reading things, looking at metadata about collections and archives. And I think this sort of leads very slightly into the question of trust around digital materials, which is whether something that is a physical object is more trusted, and something that sits in a dusty box is a more trusted source than one that is digitized and available to everyone, perhaps isn't necessarily as well provenanced. And I think it's really that question of provenance that is really valid. It's very easy for anybody to put something online. And I think we're seeing the results of dangerous and weak provenance of ideas in some of the political and sort of countercultural aspects of the internet at the moment. But the matter of trust in that is not necessary. I think digital materials can be hugely trustworthy. It's a matter of knowing where to go. And I think that problem is shared with physical artifacts as well. Some of my work on Welsh traditional music involved the work of Iolo Morgannwg, who was a Welsh poet, but also a stonemason and the originator of the bardic Gorsedd Wales, all of which was falsified, and it's taken scholars more than 100 years to unpick his falsifications. And so, you know, those were written documents, forged documents. He was an excellent forger. And so those questions exist and can only be answered by distant and close reading, you know, looking at the materials around them, looking at the materials themselves in incredible detail, and looking at other parts of history. And so those things, questions and worries exist in both worlds. And it's about the tool set that you go into with it in digital humanities, learning about digital culture, humanities itself is about equipping us to ask those questions and delve into those things.
That's great, fascinating, very helpful. Megan, I wonder if there are any closing thoughts that you would have for us before I shut us down. We're a little over time.
Yes, I think what is really apparent is the interdisciplinarity of digital humanities. Andrew has talked about his journey from a scholar of music to Prince Albert, so history. Nicholas has talked about whether he's a historian or what's going on in these legal frameworks. And I've worked in disparate fields such as numismatics and also 21st century war commemoration. And digital is the link between sometimes disparate concepts. And what we're really, really looking forward to is the ability in the new Schwarzman Centre to bring some of our humanistic colleagues who, into a physical as well as conceptual space to bring some of these ideas. Let's crash them together and see what new and exciting research ideas fall out.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to our audience, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm sorry that we've used more of your time than we had budgeted, but we appreciate you staying with us. As soon as we close, there will be a screen at the very end with some contact information if you're interested in following the work of our academics more closely. And also there's a QR code that you can point your phone at, and it will take you to a website where you can learn more about this extraordinarily amazing new humanities center that we're building, the Stephen A. Schwarzman Center on the Radcliffe Observatory Quarter. So thank you once again to our panelists and for all of those of you who joined us today. All the best.